The Battle of Ostrogozhsk Rossosh in January 1943 unfolded as one of the critical yet often overlooked operations of the Soviet winter offensives. It represented the destruction of large Axis satellite forces, primarily the Hungarian Second Army and the Italian Eighth Army, alongside German supporting units, in a manner comparable to the contemporaneous encirclement at Stalingrad. To understand the context of this battle, it is necessary to examine the geopolitical background, the state of the Eastern Front in late 1942, and the preparedness of the armies involved. The strategic context was defined by the failure of the German summer offensive, Operation Blau, launched in June 1942. Designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and secure Stalingrad on the Volga, the offensive overstretched German resources. By autumn, Soviet counteroffensives were already being prepared, taking advantage of thinly held Axis lines manned largely by Allied forces from Italy, Hungary, and Romania. These satellite armies had been deployed to hold extensive sections of the front along the Don River, freeing German divisions for the drive toward Stalingrad. However, they were poorly equipped, lacked heavy weapons, and were unprepared for large-scale Soviet offensives. Their position made them particularly vulnerable to the Soviet High Command's plan to expand the counteroffensive momentum beyond Stalingrad. For Germany, reliance on its allies was a political necessity as well as a military expedient. Hitler sought to involve the Axis partners in the crusade against Bolshevism, tying them to the fate of the war in the East. Italy had dispatched the Armies, Italian Eighth Army, numbering approximately 235,000 men under General Italo Garibaldi, to the Don River sector. Hungary had committed its Second Army under General Gustav Jani, fielding around 200,000 men. Alongside them stood remnants of the German Second Army and various support units. These forces held a front of hundreds of kilometers with limited reserves, thin artillery support, and inadequate anti-tank weaponry. Their morale was mixed. While some units were motivated by alliance commitments, many soldiers were weary, poorly acclimatized to the Russian winter, and conscious of their inferior equipment compared to both German forces and their Soviet adversaries. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had recovered from the crises of 1941 and early 1942. The Red Army was larger, better supplied, and increasingly confident after halting the German advance at Moscow and mounting strong counteroffensives. By late 1942, Soviet strategy sought not only to destroy the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, but also to exploit opportunities across the southern front. The Voronezh Front, under General Philipp Golikov, was tasked with planning and executing an offensive against the Hungarian and Italian sectors along the Middle Don. This operation, timed to coincide with the encirclement battles at Stalingrad, aimed to eliminate Axis allies, collapse German defensive lines, and open the way toward Kharkov and Kursk. Military preparedness on both sides differed sharply. The Hungarians and Italians, though fielding large formations, were severely understrength in modern equipment. Their divisions relied on outdated artillery, limited numbers of tanks, such as the Italian M1340 and Hungarian Toldi light tanks, and had only a few dozen German-made anti-tank guns. In many cases, these weapons were ineffective against Soviet T-34s and KV-1s. Winter clothing was insufficient, and rations were irregular due to logistical difficulties. German support in the sector included a handful of panzer and infantry divisions, but these were spread thin and unable to cover the vast front. The Soviets, in contrast, massed overwhelming strength for the operation. The Voronezh Front assembled more than 300,000 men, supported by around 1,000 tanks, 4,500 artillery pieces, and strong air support from the Second Air Army. Multiple combined arms armies, including the 40th Army, the 3rd Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko, and the 18th Separate Rifle Corps, were committed. Preparations were detailed and benefited from excellent intelligence about the weakness of Axis positions. The offensive would be launched in deep snow and freezing temperatures, conditions that favored the better-equipped Soviet troops, many of whom had been supplied with winter gear and trained for operations in harsh weather. Public sentiment within the Axis satellite states varied. In Italy and Hungary, Support for the war on the Eastern Front was already strained by heavy casualties suffered in 1941 to 42. Families at home were increasingly disillusioned, and political opposition to the German alliance was growing. Soldiers at the front, facing Russian winter conditions and lacking adequate supplies, often expressed resentment that their lives were being sacrificed in a German war. For the Soviet Union, on the other hand, morale was high. News of encirclement at Stalingrad boosted confidence, and propaganda emphasized that further offensives would liberate occupied territories and punish the invaders' allies. Intelligence estimates prior to the operation further illustrate the imbalance. German and Hungarian commanders were aware of Soviet buildups, but underestimated the scale of the coming assault. Reports acknowledged Soviet troop concentrations but assumed the main effort would remain at Stalingrad. Soviet intelligence, by contrast, had detailed knowledge of Axis weaknesses, correctly assessing their lack of reserves and inadequate anti-tank defenses. This asymmetry in awareness contributed significantly to the success of the Soviet plan. Thus, on the eve of January 1943, the conditions for the Battle of Ostrogozhsk Rossosh were set. Axis satellite forces, poorly armed and stretched thin, faced a Soviet army determined to capitalize on its victories and strike along the Don. The stage was prepared for a major offensive that would not only eliminate Italian and Hungarian armies as effective fighting forces, but also accelerate the collapse of Germany's southern front. The opening phase of the Battle of Ostrogozhsk Rossosh began on 13th January 1943, when the Soviet Voronezh Front launched its offensive along a broad sector of the Middle Don. This date was chosen carefully, coinciding with the encirclement battles at Stalingrad and the retreat of German forces elsewhere, ensuring that Axis satellite armies would be deprived of reinforcement and support. The Soviet plan aimed to exploit the extreme vulnerability of the Hungarian Second Army and the Italian Eighth Army, both deployed in overextended positions. In the early hours, after heavy artillery preparation, Soviet infantry and armor surged forward into snowbound terrain, initiating one of the most destructive operations for Axis allies in the entire Eastern campaign. The first strikes fell against the Hungarian Second Army, which held a sector between Svoboda and Kantemirovka. The Hungarians had dug defensive lines but lacked depth, heavy anti-tank weapons, and mobile reserves. At dawn, Soviet artillery barrages pounded their trenches, destroying command posts, communications lines, and morale. Following the bombardment, Soviet rifle divisions attacked, supported by T-34 tanks advancing through deep snow. Hungarian troops resisted stubbornly in some sectors, but were quickly overwhelmed as Soviet armor broke through. In several places, entire battalions were overrun within hours. Communications collapsed, and commanders lost contact with their units. The scale of the Soviet offensive shocked the defenders, who had not anticipated such concentrated force. Simultaneously, the Italian Eighth Army, deployed further south along the Don, came under attack. Italian divisions such as the Ravenna, Coseria, and Torino faced the full weight of the Soviet 40th Army and the 3rd Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko. Once again, Soviet artillery prepared the ground, followed by tank spearheads that shattered Italian lines. The Italians, armed with outdated artillery and light anti-tank guns, could do little to stop T-34s. Isolated resistance points, sometimes led by determined officers, managed to delay Soviet advances briefly, but without adequate reserves or armor, these defenses soon collapsed. Many Italian units, lacking winter clothing and exhausted after months in the trenches, disintegrated when confronted with massed Soviet attacks. German support in the sector was minimal during the opening days. The German Second Army was stretched thin, unable to provide substantial reinforcement to the Hungarians or Italians. A handful of German panzer units attempted to stabilize sectors, but they were too few to halt the Soviet momentum. The Luftwaffe, weakened by losses at Stalingrad and shortages of fuel, could not contest Soviet air superiority effectively. Soviet aircraft of the Second Air Army attacked rail lines, bridges, and retreating columns, further compounding Axis difficulties. The balance of power was decisively in favor of the Soviets from the very first hours. Civilian populations in the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh region experienced the opening phase with both fear and anticipation. Many had endured months of Axis occupation, forced labor, and requisitioning of food. Soviet advances were greeted with relief in some villages, though civilians were also caught in the crossfire, exposed to artillery bombardments and aerial strikes. Evacuations were chaotic. Axis troops often commandeered sledges and carts from villagers, leaving families behind. The harsh winter compounded suffering as temperatures plunged below 20 degrees Celsius, turning retreats into ordeals of survival. Command structures on the Axis side quickly began to collapse. Hungarian General Gustav Gianni and Italian General Italo Garibaldi issued desperate orders to hold positions, but the rapid Soviet breakthroughs rendered them irrelevant. Units reported encirclement within the first 2 days, and entire divisions lost cohesion. Some attempted to retreat toward the west, only to be cut off by advancing Soviet tank columns. Others surrendered in groups after exhausting their ammunition. German liaison officers reported to higher command that both Allied armies were collapsing under pressure, and that the front could no longer be stabilized without massive reinforcement. For the Soviets, the opening phase confirmed the effectiveness of their planning. Breakthroughs were achieved faster than expected, and resistance was lighter than anticipated. Soviet commanders pushed their forces aggressively, seeking to exploit the disintegration of Axis lines and encircle as many troops as possible. By 15th January, Soviet spearheads were advancing rapidly into the rear of Hungarian and Italian positions, severing communications and isolating units. What had begun as a frontal assault was quickly transforming into a broad encirclement operation, threatening to annihilate entire armies. The opening days of the battle set the tone for what followed. The Hungarians and Italians, inadequately prepared for modern mechanized warfare in winter conditions, were shattered by overwhelming Soviet power. Soviet planning, combining artillery, armor, and air support, proved decisive. Within 48 hours, the Axis front along the Middle Don was collapsing, and the Soviet High Command was already preparing to exploit this victory by advancing deeper into Ukraine. The opening phase thus marked the beginning of the end for the Axis satellite armies on the Eastern Front. The strategic framework of the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh operation was shaped by the shifting balance on the Eastern Front in late 1942 and early 1943. For the Soviet Union, the battle was part of a wider series of coordinated offensives designed to exploit the destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad and collapse Axis defenses along the Don. For the Axis, by contrast, the Hungarian Second Army and the Italian Eighth Army were tasked with holding long stretches of the front with inadequate resources, their role more political than military. The objectives of both sides reveal the imbalance that determined the outcome even before the first shots were fired. From the Soviet perspective, the goals were clear and ambitious. Stalin and the Stavka, Soviet High Command, had approved a winter campaign plan that sought to maintain relentless pressure on the Axis across the entire southern sector. The Voronezh Front, under General Philipp Golikov, was assigned to strike along the Middle Don. The operation aimed to eliminate Axis satellite armies, liberate territory in the Voronezh and Kharkov regions, and create favorable conditions for a deeper offensive into Ukraine. The destruction of these Allied forces would deprive Germany of crucial manpower and expose its southern flank. Specifically, Soviet planning identified the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army as vulnerable targets. They lacked strong armored formations, their defensive lines were thin, and their morale was low. By concentrating superior forces against these weak points, the Soviets intended to encircle and annihilate them in a matter of days. The operational plan called for coordinated attacks by several major Soviet formations. The 40th Army, the 18th Separate Rifle Corps, and the 3rd Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko were to deliver the main blows. Supporting them were the 60th Army and elements of the Bryansk Front, intended to secure the flanks and prevent German counterattacks. The 2nd Air Army provided air support, ensuring Soviet dominance in the skies. Intelligence and reconnaissance were thorough. Soviet aerial surveys and partisan reports had mapped Axis positions, identified weak sectors, and confirmed the absence of strong mobile reserves. The timing was synchronized with Operation Little Saturn and the encirclement at Stalingrad, ensuring that the Germans would be too preoccupied elsewhere to reinforce their allies on the Don. For the Axis, the strategic goals were far less ambitious and more defensive in nature. After the failure of Operation Blau, German High Command sought to stabilize the front by holding the line along the Don River. Hitler's directive insisted that Axis allies remain in their positions, both to demonstrate political commitment to the war against the Soviet Union and to free German divisions for operations elsewhere. The Hungarian Second Army was deployed on a sector of approximately 200 kilometers, with divisions spread so thin that defensive depth was impossible. The Italian Eighth Army faced similar problems, with wide gaps between units and inadequate reserves. German support was limited to a few scattered divisions and liaison staffs. The German High Command recognized the weakness of these positions, but relied on the assumption that the Soviets would not have the strength to launch a major offensive outside Stalingrad. The Italian Eighth Army, under General Italo Garibaldi, had been ordered to hold its ground regardless of circumstances. Italian leadership understood the risks, but had little choice. Political pressure from Mussolini demanded continued participation in the war, and German authorities insisted on Italian compliance. The Hungarian Second Army, commanded by General Gustav Jani, faced similar constraints. Hungary's leadership, tied to Germany by alliance and fearing territorial losses in Central Europe, had committed its second-largest military formation to the Eastern Front. Both armies, however, were poorly prepared for sustained winter combat. Their supply lines stretched back through occupied Ukraine, vulnerable to partisan attacks and hindered by snowbound roads. Ammunition and fuel stocks were limited, and many units had little more than 2 weeks' supplies on hand at the start of January 1943. Doctrinal differences also shaped the course of planning. The Soviets had adopted a doctrine of deep operations, emphasizing combined arms breakthroughs, rapid exploitation by mechanized forces, and encirclement of enemy groups. The 3rd Tank Army was specifically tasked with penetrating deep into the Axis rear, cutting off retreat and supply routes. Infantry formations would follow, mopping up surrounded forces. The Axis satellite armies, by contrast, adhered to static defense, holding linear positions with minimal reserves. Their doctrine had been shaped by outdated First World War models of trench warfare, not by modern mechanized maneuver. Without sufficient mobile forces, they could not counter Soviet breakthroughs once they occurred. Propaganda on both sides further illustrates the strategic aims. Soviet newspapers hailed the coming operations as the continuation of the Stalingrad encirclement, promising the destruction of all invaders on Soviet soil. Red Army units were told they were liberating Russian and Ukrainian villages from occupation, boosting morale and encouraging aggressive action. Axis propaganda, on the other hand, painted the Eastern Front as a shared European crusade against communism, but morale among Hungarian and Italian troops remained low. Soldiers at the front often doubted the value of their sacrifices, writing in letters home about poor equipment and lack of German support. Such attitudes undermined cohesion and prepared the ground for collapse when the Soviet offensive struck. Miscalculations were critical. German intelligence underestimated Soviet strength in the sector, believing that the Red Army's main reserves were concentrated at Stalingrad and along the lower Don. Reports from the Hungarian and Italian commands about Soviet buildups were dismissed or downplayed. Soviet deception measures further concealed the scale of the offensive. Meanwhile, Axis planners overestimated the ability of Allied troops to hold their positions, assuming that even if breakthroughs occurred, German divisions could intervene in time to prevent disaster. These assumptions proved fatally flawed. By early January 1943, the disparity in preparation was stark. The Voronezh front had concentrated more than 300,000 troops, supported by over 1,000 tanks and 4,500 artillery pieces, ready to launch an offensive across a 250-kilometer front. Opposing them, the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army fielded roughly 400,000 men combined, but with fewer than 200 tanks, many obsolete, and limited heavy artillery. Their anti-tank defenses were wholly inadequate against Soviet armor. German reinforcements were tied down elsewhere and unavailable for immediate support. The imbalance ensured that once the operation began, Axis forces would face destruction on a scale rivaling the disaster at Stalingrad. Thus, the strategic goals and planning of the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh operation were defined by Soviet determination to exploit Axis weaknesses and Axis reliance on fragile Allied armies to hold a vast front. Soviet objectives were aggressive, carefully prepared, and supported by overwhelming force. Axis objectives were defensive, politically constrained, and based on misjudgment. The outcome, therefore, was less a question of if the Soviets would succeed, but rather how quickly and how completely the Axis satellite armies would be destroyed once the offensive was unleashed. The Soviet offensive began on the morning of 13th of January 1943 with a massive artillery barrage that thundered across the frozen steppe along the Don. The initial bombardment lasted for hours, smashing Hungarian and Italian trenches, cutting telephone lines, and disorganizing command posts. Snow-covered fields turned black from shell impacts, and the psychological effect was immediate. For Axis soldiers already weakened by cold and shortages, the sudden storm of steel marked the collapse of any illusion that their defensive lines could withstand the onslaught. Following the artillery preparation, Soviet infantry surged forward in waves, supported by tanks from the 3rd Tank Army and close air support from the 2nd Air Army. The Hungarians bore the brunt of the initial attack. The 7th and 12th Hungarian Light Divisions, holding exposed positions near Uriv and Kantemirovka, were hit hardest. Soviet T-34s advanced through deep snow, overrunning Hungarian forward positions. Attempts to resist with 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns failed. Shells bounced harmlessly off the armored hulls. Within hours, entire regiments were shattered. Soviet infantry infiltrated villages, forcing defenders into chaotic retreats. Many Hungarian soldiers abandoned heavy equipment in the snow, retreating on foot or sledges under continuous fire. The Italians faced a similar disaster along their sector. The Caesarea and Ravenna divisions, deployed near Rossosh, were assaulted by Soviet rifle corps reinforced with armor. Italian infantry fought with determination in some areas, particularly in fortified strongpoints, but their outdated weapons and lack of winter gear proved decisive handicaps. The Soviet 40th Army used combined arms tactics effectively. Artillery cleared trenches, infantry followed to secure ground, and tanks pressed on into the rear. Italian units quickly became isolated, cut off from neighboring divisions. Without adequate communication and with German liaison officers unable to coordinate effective responses, Italian command structures disintegrated. By the evening of 13th of January, Soviet spearheads had advanced up to 20 kilometers into Axis positions. German supporting units attempted to stabilize the situation. Elements of the German 57th Infantry Division and small detachments of panzers were rushed to the front, but their numbers were insufficient. They managed to delay Soviet advances in certain localities, such as near Alexeyevka, where German and Hungarian troops mounted counterattacks, briefly halting Soviet tank columns. However, these actions could not prevent the encirclement of Hungarian and Italian forces in wider sectors. Soviet commanders had anticipated such resistance and committed reserves quickly, ensuring momentum was maintained. By 14th January, the scale of the Soviet breakthrough was apparent. The 3rd Tank Army, advancing rapidly through gaps in Hungarian defenses, began to wheel southward toward Rossosh, threatening to encircle large parts of the Hungarian Second Army. The 18th Separate Rifle Corps simultaneously pressed westward, linking with other Soviet formations and creating a pocket around retreating Axis troops. The speed of Soviet armor in deep snow shocked Axis commanders, who had assumed that winter conditions would slow mechanized operations. Instead, Soviet logistical preparations, including the use of tracked vehicles and sled convoys, enabled rapid exploitation. Civilian populations in the combat zone were immediately affected. Villages changed hands within hours, with Soviet forces advancing, Axis units retreating, and battles fought in narrow streets. Many civilians fled into forests, dragging belongings on sledges, while others were trapped in basements during bombardments. Reports from both Soviet and German sides describe scenes of chaos: burning houses, frozen corpses in fields, and columns of refugees intermingled with retreating soldiers. Soviet authorities encouraged civilians to assist their troops with intelligence, while Axis soldiers often seized food and horses in desperation, worsening the plight of the local population. By 15th January, the Hungarian Second Army was effectively broken. Divisions that had once held long front lines dissolved into fragments. Some groups attempted to retreat west toward Oskol, but Soviet tanks cut their routes. Entire Hungarian battalions were surrounded and destroyed, command posts ceased to function, and General Johnny could no longer exercise coherent control. German liaison officers reported to Army Group B headquarters that the Hungarian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The collapse was faster than even Soviet planners had expected, a testament to the fragility of Axis allied armies once subjected to concentrated mechanized assault. The Italians fared no better. The Soviet 40th Army penetrated their lines at multiple points, forcing divisions into chaotic withdrawals. Units abandoned artillery and supply dumps, retreating in disorder across frozen rivers. Some Italian soldiers fought on in isolated pockets, encircled in villages such as Veluki, but without relief these positions became death traps. By 16th January, Soviet forces were in control of Rossosh, the headquarters of the Italian Alpine Corps, effectively severing coordination across the Italian 8th Army. Prisoners captured in large numbers revealed the state of Axis morale: exhausted, hungry, and resigned to defeat. The early engagements demonstrated the stark contrast between Soviet and Axis capabilities. The Soviets had mastered the integration of artillery, armor, infantry, and air power, applying pressure across the front and exploiting weaknesses decisively. The Hungarians and Italians, deployed in static defenses without depth or mobility, were incapable of adapting. The Wehrmacht, though superior in doctrine and experience, had too few forces in the sector to compensate. As Soviet breakthroughs deepened, the Axis allies faced encirclement on a massive scale, comparable in scope to the disaster unfolding simultaneously at Stalingrad. By the end of the first week of fighting, Soviet forces had advanced 50 to 70 kilometers along multiple axes, shattering the cohesion of Axis defenses. Encircled groups of Hungarians and Italians attempted to break out, but without fuel, artillery support, or coordination, these efforts ended in failure. The battlefield was littered with abandoned equipment, horse-drawn carts frozen in the snow, broken artillery pieces, and destroyed tanks. Thousands of prisoners streamed into Soviet captivity, many frostbitten and near starvation. The clash had moved beyond a frontal battle into a systematic destruction of Axis satellite armies, with the first engagements already sealing their fate. By 16th January 1943, the battle had moved beyond initial breakthroughs into a full-scale crisis for the Axis forces. What had begun as local penetrations of Hungarian and Italian lines escalated rapidly into deep Soviet thrusts that threatened to encircle entire armies. The Soviets pressed their advantage with speed and precision, while the Axis allies, already weakened by shortages and lack of reserves, collapsed under the strain. The Soviet 3rd Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko became the spearhead of the offensive. Having broken through Hungarian positions, its armored brigades drove southward in deep snow, encircling retreating Axis units and capturing key road junctions. By 17 January, they linked with infantry formations of the 40th Army, completing several pockets around Hungarian and Italian divisions. The 18th Separate Rifle Corps advanced simultaneously, cutting westward to block routes of withdrawal. Soviet planning ensured that breakthroughs were immediately exploited, preventing Axis forces from establishing secondary lines of defense. The crisis was particularly acute for the Hungarian Second Army. Out of its 200,000 men, entire corps were now cut off. The 7 and 9 Corps, holding the central sector, were surrounded after their flanks collapsed. Attempts to retreat westward failed, as Soviet armored spearheads had already reached Voloiki and Ostrogozhsk, severing escape routes. General Janney's headquarters received fragmentary reports, but coordination was impossible. Divisions disintegrated into scattered groups, attempting to break out on their own. Frostbite, lack of food, and constant air attacks reduced their ability to resist. German liaison officers reported that Hungarian combat effectiveness had fallen to near zero. The Italians faced a parallel disaster. The Eighth Army, deployed along the Don Bend, found its divisions isolated one after another. The Caseria and Ravenna divisions were cut off in the north, while the Alpine Corps, including the Tridentina and Giulia divisions, faced encirclement further south near Rossosh. On 17th of January, Soviet units entered Rossosh itself, capturing the headquarters of the Alpine Corps and cutting communications across the Italian sector. Thousands of Italian soldiers, lacking transport and proper winter clothing, attempted desperate marches westward in temperatures dropping below 25 degrees C. Columns stretched across frozen roads, constantly harassed by Soviet tanks and aircraft. Casualties from frostbite often equaled those from combat. German forces attempted to intervene, but their numbers were inadequate. Elements of the 24th Panzer Corps and a few infantry divisions were committed to counterattacks, but these forces were heavily outnumbered. At Alexeyevka and Novi Oskol, German and Hungarian units briefly managed to hold Soviet advances, but their resistance only delayed the inevitable. The Luftwaffe launched limited sorties, but shortages of fuel and the dominance of Soviet fighter and bomber groups made air support minimal. Axis command recognized the crisis, yet Hitler's orders to hold positions prevented organized withdrawals, further contributing to the encirclement. The terrain and weather intensified the escalation. Heavy snowdrifts slowed movement, making mechanized retreat difficult, while Soviet armor, supported by tracked supply vehicles, continued to advance. Rivers and frozen marshes became barriers that trapped Axis columns, which were then destroyed by Soviet artillery. Villages turned into strongpoints, but Soviet infantry, supported by flamethrowers and direct tank fire, cleared them systematically. Resistance, though often determined at the local level, could not alter the larger picture of collapse. Civilian populations suffered heavily during this phase. Villages were shelled and burned, with inhabitants often forced to abandon their homes in the middle of winter. Axis troops in retreat commandeered food, sledges, and horses, while Soviet forces requisitioned supplies for advancing units. Civilians were caught between front lines, and many perished from exposure or bombardment. Soviet propaganda framed the battle as liberation, but for those living in the combat zone, survival became the only priority. By 1819 January, the crisis had reached its peak. Soviet forces advanced up to 100 kilometers from their starting positions, encircling tens of thousands of Axis troops. The Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army were effectively destroyed as coherent fighting forces. Only scattered groups attempted to retreat westward, many of which would later be annihilated in the snow-covered fields near Voloiki and Novi Oskol. The Wehrmacht, overstretched and preoccupied with Stalingrad, could not commit sufficient reserves to rescue its allies. The crisis at Ostrogozhsk Rossosh had escalated beyond containment, setting the stage for the complete destruction of Axis satellite armies in the coming days. By January 1943, the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh operation reached its peak. Soviet armies pressed deep into Axis rear areas, sealing encirclements and systematically destroying the remnants of the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army. The battle had evolved from a series of breakthroughs into a coordinated annihilation, marked by mass surrenders, desperate retreats, and the near-total collapse of Axis Allied formations. The Soviet Third Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko spearheaded the encirclement effort. Its brigades advanced rapidly toward Voloiki, a key junction where Axis forces attempted to regroup. On 19th of January, Soviet tanks cut the last escape routes westward, trapping large concentrations of Hungarian and Italian troops. Simultaneously, the 40th Army pushed southward, linking with infantry units of the 18th Separate Rifle Corps to complete the encirclement ring. By this stage, more than 70,000 Axis soldiers were trapped in several pockets, with little hope of relief. Inside the encircled areas, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Hungarian divisions, already weakened by days of combat and losses, faced starvation, frostbite, and ammunition shortages. Many units lacked functioning radios, and commanders could not coordinate defensive efforts. Entire battalions surrendered after exhausting their supplies, often in frozen fields surrounded by Soviet armor. The Hungarian 7th Corps ceased to exist as an organized formation, while remnants of the 99th Corps attempted small-scale breakout attempts that were quickly crushed. Out of nearly 200,000 Hungarian troops committed at the start of the battle, only a fraction remained combat-capable by this stage. The Italians endured a parallel ordeal. The Alpine Corps, including the Tridentina, Julia, and Kunitz divisions, became the focal point of Soviet attacks. These divisions, famed for their mountain warfare skills, were ill-suited to mechanized combat on the open steppe. On 20th January, Soviet forces seized Rossosh and Veliky, cutting the Alpine Corps into isolated groups. Thousands of Italians were forced into long, desperate retreats through deep snow, with temperatures plunging below 25 degrees Celsius. Their supply columns, largely horse-drawn, collapsed under the pressure. Frostbite claimed as many lives as Soviet gunfire. Some Alpine units, such as the Tridentina Division, managed to maintain cohesion and fought desperate rearguard actions, but without relief or supplies, their fate was sealed. German units attempted limited countermeasures. Elements of the 24th Panzer Corps and supporting infantry divisions tried to hold open corridors for retreat, but they were overwhelmed by Soviet numbers. The Luftwaffe made sporadic attempts to resupply encircled groups from the air, dropping food and ammunition, but these efforts were small in scale and often intercepted by Soviet fighters. The German High Command, still focused on the disaster unfolding at Stalingrad, lacked the reserves to mount a major rescue. Hitler's insistence that Axis allies continued to hold their ground, even as their armies disintegrated, only deepened the catastrophe. Soviet commanders capitalized fully on the situation. Rybalko's tank brigades exploited every gap, while Golikov's Voronezh front coordinated infantry and artillery to tighten the encirclement. Soviet air superiority ensured that Axis columns retreating across open ground were relentlessly harassed. By 21st January, Soviet spearheads had advanced more than 100 kilometers, eliminating organized resistance in the Rossosh-Veliky region. Prisoners were taken in tens of thousands. Soviet reports noted that entire Hungarian and Italian regiments surrendered without resistance, their soldiers exhausted and frostbitten. Civilian populations in the region witnessed the climax of the battle with mixed experiences. For some, Soviet advances meant liberation from Axis occupation. For others, the destruction of villages during fighting brought further hardship. Axis retreating forces often looted food and seized sledges, while advancing Soviet units requisitioned supplies for their troops. Civilians were caught between armies, their survival depending on endurance through bombardments and the brutal winter. By 22nd January, the battle's peak had passed into its final phase. The Axis pocket at Veliky collapsed completely, with thousands of Hungarian and Italian soldiers surrendering after failed breakout attempts. The scale of losses was immense. The Hungarian Second Army suffered approximately 120,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. The Italian Eighth Army lost over 100,000 men, nearly two-thirds of its strength. The Wehrmacht, which had relied on these allies to hold vast sections of the Don front, now faced a gaping hole in its southern line. Soviet commanders had achieved their objectives with speed and decisiveness, destroying two major Axis armies in less than 2 weeks of combat. The peak of the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh battle thus represented one of the most devastating defeats for Germany's European allies during the Second World War. While overshadowed by the more famous encirclement at Stalingrad, The destruction of the Hungarian and Italian armies on the Don carried enormous consequences for Axis strategy and morale. It confirmed the fragility of Germany's coalition and underscored the Red Army's growing ability to conduct complex, large-scale offensive operations even in the harshest winter conditions. As the Soviet encirclement tightened in the third week of January 1943, the remnants of the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army attempted to adapt to the desperate situation. Though both armies were effectively broken, fragments of units continued to resist in pockets across the snow-covered steppes, and commanders tried to organize breakouts or establish defensive lines in villages and along frozen rivers. These efforts, while determined in some cases, could not alter the wider outcome, but they revealed how Axis troops struggled to adapt under catastrophic conditions. Among the Hungarians, resistance was often local and improvised. Company and battalion-sized groups entrenched themselves in farmhouses and villages, using available artillery and machine guns to delay Soviet advances. Some officers tried to consolidate scattered units into fighting groups capable of delaying Soviet tanks. At Alexeyevka and Novy Oskol, Hungarian and German detachments briefly held out, inflicting losses on Soviet infantry before being overrun. However, without communications or supply, these actions were isolated. Ammunition was quickly depleted, and the troops lacked winter equipment to endure prolonged fighting in sub-zero conditions. Resistance was thus brave but unsustainable, and many groups either surrendered or were annihilated. The Italians, particularly the Alpine Corps, attempted a more organized adaptation. The Tridentina Division, led by General Luigi Reverberi, managed to preserve cohesion during the retreat. Using rearguard tactics, the division conducted fighting withdrawals through snow-covered terrain, holding off Soviet infantry and armor long enough for thousands of Italian soldiers to escape encirclement temporarily. Columns of soldiers marched westward in freezing weather, often without food or transport, but discipline in some Alpine units allowed them to maintain order. The Julia and Kuninci divisions were less fortunate, suffering heavy casualties in repeated Soviet attacks. Nonetheless, the Alpini's resistance became one of the most noted episodes of the battle, a demonstration of how adaptation and discipline could briefly prolong survival, even in hopeless conditions. German units scattered among the Allies also played a role in resistance. Small detachments of German infantry and armor attempted counterattacks to keep retreat corridors open. At times, German tanks supported Hungarian or Italian infantry in holding villages, slowing Soviet advances for hours or days. However, the scale of Soviet operations meant these actions could not change the overall picture. German commanders reported that their allies often lacked the strength to execute coordinated maneuvers, and even determined stands dissolved when Soviet artillery and armor concentrated against them. Improvisation was evident in logistical adaptations. Retreating Axis troops used sledges, horses, and even civilian carts to carry the wounded and transport supplies. Soldiers scavenged food from abandoned villages and slaughtered horses for sustenance. Some troops stripped the dead of clothing to survive the freezing temperatures. Field hospitals collapsed under the strain, and many wounded were left behind in barns or churches, captured when Soviet forces arrived. These improvised measures extended survival for some, but they underscored the desperate state of Axis forces by this stage of the battle. Psychologically, resistance and adaptation carried a heavy toll. Hungarian and Italian soldiers often wrote in diaries or letters, later recovered, about the hopelessness of their situation. Many felt abandoned by Germany, as German units withdrew or failed to mount rescue operations. Desertions increased, with some soldiers abandoning their units to seek shelter or surrender. At the same time, others fought on stubbornly, motivated by discipline, comradeship, or fear of Soviet captivity. Resistance, therefore, varied greatly, from organized withdrawals to chaotic collapse, reflecting the fragmented state of armies under encirclement. Partisan activity also shaped this phase. Soviet partisans, active in the Don region, provided intelligence to the advancing Red Army, harassed Axis retreat columns, and sabotaged bridges and supply routes. Their presence made adaptation even more difficult for Axis forces, as they faced not only the regular Red Army, but also irregular forces behind their lines. Civilians sometimes aided partisans, but they also suffered reprisals from retreating Axis troops, who destroyed villages suspected of collaboration. By 23 January, resistance was sporadic and largely symbolic. Small groups of Italians and Hungarians attempted breakouts westward, some managing to reach German lines after days of marching through snow and suffering heavy losses. The majority, however, were captured or killed. The adaptations made by Axis troops, fighting withdrawals, improvised logistics, and local defenses, delayed Soviet advances only marginally. The Red Army's numerical superiority, control of the air, and mastery of combined arms tactics ensured that resistance, however determined, could not prevent the destruction of both armies. By the fourth week of January 1943, the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh operation reached its decisive turning point. The Soviet encirclement was complete, the Axis allies were cut off, and the battle shifted from fluid maneuver to the systematic destruction of trapped forces. This moment defined the outcome. From a large-scale retreat and resistance, the struggle became a one-sided collapse where Axis troops faced either annihilation or captivity. The critical events unfolded around Valoiki, a small town that became the focal point of Axis attempts to escape. Thousands of Hungarian and Italian soldiers converged there, seeking to break out westward toward German lines. Soviet forces anticipated this concentration and moved rapidly to block every route. The 3rd Tank Army positioned armored brigades along key roads, while rifle divisions of the 40th Army entrenched in surrounding villages. Soviet artillery blanketed escape corridors, turning roads into killing zones. On 1920 January, Axis breakout attempts began, but they quickly disintegrated under fire. Columns of exhausted men and horse-drawn carts advanced through snow only to be cut apart by tanks and machine guns. Survivors scattered into the countryside, where most were rounded up within days. For the Hungarian Second Army, the turning point was catastrophic. Once numbering more than 200,000 men, it now existed only as isolated groups. The 7 and 9 Corps ceased to function as military formations. Encircled troops surrendered in their thousands, with Soviet reports estimating 60,000 prisoners taken from Hungarian units alone. General Gustav Jani could do little but issue orders that no longer reached his shattered divisions. The collapse of his army marked the effective destruction of Hungary's largest military commitment to the Eastern Front. This loss not only weakened Germany's coalition, but also changed Hungary's political position at home, as discontent grew over the sacrifice of so many men in a distant war. The Italians reached their own decisive moment in the fate of the Alpine Corps. Surrounded near Rossosh and Valoiki, the Tridentina Division attempted a breakout on 21st January, leading columns westward in bitter cold. Unlike other units, the Alpini retained discipline and cohesion, fighting rearguard actions to keep Soviet forces at bay. In one of the most desperate marches of the war, the Tridentina covered over 100 kilometers in deep snow, harassed constantly by Soviet attacks. Out of tens of thousands who began the retreat, only a fraction reached German lines. The Julia and Kuninci divisions were less fortunate. Most of their soldiers perished or were captured during the breakout attempts. This marked the destruction of Italy's 8th Army as an effective fighting force. For Italy, the defeat was second only to Stalingrad in scale and consequence. For the Soviets, the turning point confirmed the success of their operational doctrine. The encirclement at Ostrogozhsk Rossosh was completed more quickly than expected, with Axis allies collapsing within a week of the initial assault. Soviet commanders ensured no escape corridors remained open, learning from past battles where German units had managed to withdraw. The use of coordinated tank and infantry thrusts, supported by aviation, guaranteed that the encirclement held firm. By 22 January, Soviet reports stated that organized Axis resistance in the sector had ended, leaving only mopping up operations against scattered groups. The wider implications were immediate. The destruction of the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army opened a 250-kilometer gap in the Axis front along the Don. German divisions, already overstretched, could not fill this vacuum. The Soviet High Command quickly ordered follow-up operations, exploiting the collapse to advance toward Kharkov and Kursk. The battle's turning point thus marked not only the destruction of two Axis armies, but also the unraveling of Germany's defensive line in southern Russia. For civilians, the turning point brought both relief and further suffering. Villages once under Axis occupation were retaken by Soviet forces, but many were left in ruins from bombardments and fighting. Civilians who had endured months of occupation now faced shortages of food and fuel in the depths of winter. Still, for many, the Soviet advance meant liberation from requisitions, forced labor, and reprisals. Soviet authorities began re-establishing control, mobilizing civilians for reconstruction and military support. The human cost remained enormous, but the shift in momentum gave hope that the front was moving westward, away from their homes. By the end of January, the turning point of the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh battle was complete. The Hungarian and Italian armies had been destroyed, their survivors captured or scattered. The Red Army had proven its ability to coordinate large-scale encirclements outside of Stalingrad, further undermining the Axis war effort. From this moment, the southern wing of the German Eastern Front would remain unstable, with consequences stretching into the battles for Kharkov and Kursk in the months to come. By late January 1943, the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh operation had ended as a decisive Soviet victory, but its aftermath unfolded in scenes of chaos, devastation, and humanitarian crisis. The remnants of the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army ceased to exist as coherent forces, with their survivors retreating in scattered columns or falling into Soviet captivity. The immediate consequences of the battle were measured not only in military losses, but also in the collapse of morale, political repercussions at home, and the suffering of civilians across the Don Basin. The Hungarian Second Army was effectively annihilated. Out of nearly 200,000 men committed at the beginning of January, only around 40,000 escaped encirclement and managed to reach German lines. Many of these survivors were frostbitten, exhausted, and unfit for further combat. The remainder were killed, wounded, or captured. Hungarian sources later estimated 100,000 casualties, including over 60,000 prisoners of war. This represented the largest single military disaster in Hungarian history. In Budapest, news of the defeat caused political shockwaves, undermining confidence in the alliance with Germany and fueling debates about Hungary's continued participation in the war. The Italian Eighth Army suffered equally devastating losses. From a starting strength of approximately 235,000 men, more than 114,000 were lost in the battle, killed, missing, or captured. The Alpine Corps endured a particularly tragic fate. Though the Tridentina Division succeeded in leading a breakout and saving several thousand men, the Giulia and Cuninsi divisions were virtually wiped out. Italian prisoners marched into Soviet captivity by the tens of thousands, many of whom would never return. In Italy, the defeat deepened war weariness and eroded Mussolini's prestige, contributing to the eventual collapse of fascist authority later in 1943. For Germany, the aftermath revealed the dangers of over-reliance on allies. The destruction of two satellite armies left the Wehrmacht exposed along a wide sector of the southern front. German divisions had to be rushed into the breach to prevent a complete Soviet breakthrough toward Kharkov and the Dnieper. Yet these reinforcements were limited, as the Wehrmacht was still engaged in the struggle to contain the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad. The German command faced the reality that its coalition partners could no longer sustain the burden of the Eastern Front, forcing Berlin to divert more of its own dwindling resources. The withdrawal of Axis remnants was harrowing. Survivors of the Hungarian and Italian armies attempted to retreat westward across snow-covered plains in temperatures below 25 degrees C. Many lacked proper footwear, gloves, or food. Horse-drawn wagons broke down in the snow, leaving wounded to die on the roadside. Soviet aircraft strafed retreating columns, while Red Army cavalry and partisans harassed survivors. Thousands froze to death in open fields. Those who reached German lines often arrived in small, disorganized groups, unrecognizable as divisions. Eyewitnesses described scenes of gaunt men with frostbitten limbs, many unable to walk, collapsing at collection points. For civilians, the aftermath was equally grim. Villages in the Rossosh and Ostrogozhsk districts were devastated by fighting. Burned houses, destroyed farms, and dead livestock marked the landscape. Civilians who had survived the occupation now faced shortages of food and clothing in the depths of winter. Soviet authorities immediately began mobilizing local populations for reconstruction, clearing roads, repairing bridges, and providing intelligence about Axis movements. Yet the human toll was severe. Reprisals during Axis retreats had claimed many lives, and families were left destitute in the frozen countryside. The humanitarian crisis extended into Soviet prisoner of war camps. Tens of thousands of Hungarians and Italians were captured during the operation. They were marched eastward, often for hundreds of kilometers, with little food or shelter. Many died along the way from exposure and disease. Those who survived faced years in captivity, with only a fraction returning home after the war. For both Hungary and Italy, the fate of these prisoners became a lasting scar in national memory. The Red Army, meanwhile, consolidated its victory. By the end of January, the Voronezh front had advanced over 100 kilometers, eliminating enemy resistance along the Don. Soviet propaganda celebrated the destruction of two major Axis armies as proof of the Red Army's growing strength. The success at Ostrogozhsk Rossosh, combined with the encirclement at Stalingrad, demonstrated the ability of Soviet forces to launch and sustain multiple large-scale offensives simultaneously. This marked a turning point in the war in southern Russia, as the Wehrmacht began to lose strategic initiative. The immediate military aftermath also influenced subsequent operations. With Axis defenses shattered, Soviet commanders prepared to advance toward Kharkov and Kursk, setting the stage for the battles of February and March 1943. Though the Wehrmacht would temporarily recover and launch counteroffensives, the destruction of Hungarian and Italian forces permanently weakened the Axis presence on the Eastern Front. Thus, the aftermath of the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh battle was not only a matter of numbers, but a transformation of the strategic situation. The Soviet Union eliminated two enemy armies, Germany lost critical allies, and both Hungary and Italy suffered blows that they would never recover from militarily or politically. The withdrawal of survivors, the devastation of villages, and the loss of tens of thousands of men in captivity left a legacy of suffering that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. The Battle of Ostrogozhsk Rossosh, fought between 13 and 27 January 1943, left a legacy that extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. Though overshadowed in historical memory by the encirclement at Stalingrad, it was one of the most devastating defeats suffered by Germany's European allies during the Second World War. The destruction of the Hungarian Second Army and Italian Eighth Army had long-term military, political, and cultural consequences, reshaping the war in southern Russia and altering the position of Hungary and Italy within the Axis alliance. From a military perspective, the battle demonstrated the Red Army's growing operational mastery. The Soviets had successfully coordinated multiple armies, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation into a combined arms offensive in harsh winter conditions. The encirclement and annihilation of Axis troops mirrored the larger operations at Stalingrad, proving that such victories were not isolated events, but part of a wider Soviet strategy. The Red Army's ability to launch successive offensives across a broad front marked the decline of German initiative on the Eastern Front. After Ostrogozhsk Rossosh, the Wehrmacht was forced into increasingly defensive operations, while its coalition partners were effectively removed as serious military contributors. For Hungary, the consequences were catastrophic. The Second Army, numbering nearly 200,000 men, was destroyed, with around 120,000 killed, wounded, or captured. This loss crippled Hungary's military capacity for the remainder of the war. Politically, the disaster deepened opposition to Germany within Hungarian society and the ruling elite. By 1944, Hungary would attempt to distance itself from the Axis, though too late to alter its fate. In Hungarian memory, the defeat became a national tragedy, commemorated as the darkest chapter of its modern military history. For Italy, the destruction of the Eighth Army was equally profound. More than 100,000 casualties, combined with the collapse of the Alpine Corps, undermined Mussolini's prestige and exposed the weakness of Italy's military commitment on the Eastern Front. The defeat contributed to growing discontent at home, which culminated later in 1943 with Mussolini's downfall and Italy's eventual withdrawal from the Axis alliance. Among Italian veterans and families, the tragedy of the Dawn became synonymous with loss and sacrifice, remembered alongside El Alamein as evidence of Italy's overstretch in the global conflict. For Germany, the battle underscored the limits of its coalition strategy. Hitler's reliance on Allied armies to hold vast sections of the Eastern Front had freed German divisions for offensives elsewhere, but it created weak points that the Soviets exploited with devastating effect. After January 1943, Berlin could no longer depend on its allies to maintain frontline sectors. German divisions had to assume responsibility for longer stretches of the front, straining resources at a time when manpower and materiel were already stretched thin. The loss of allies also weakened the political cohesion of the Axis, as both Hungary and Italy questioned their commitment to a war that brought only ruin. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Ostrogozhsk Rossosh reinforced the sense that the tide of war was turning irreversibly. Soviet propaganda hailed the battle as a triumph equal to Stalingrad, emphasizing the destruction of fascist lackeys alongside German forces. In occupied territories, the liberation of towns like Ostrogozhsk and Rossosh boosted morale and inspired further resistance. In strategic terms, the victory opened the way for Soviet advances toward Kharkov and Kursk, shaping the course of operations in 1943. The Red Army's growing confidence was evident. The encirclement of major enemy forces was no longer exceptional, but increasingly standard practice. Culturally and historically, the battle became part of the broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War. In Soviet historiography, it symbolized not only the destruction of Axis allies, but also the collective effort of Soviet soldiers and civilians in achieving liberation. Memorials were later erected in Russia to commemorate the victory, while in Hungary and Italy, the memory of the battle carried a different weight, one of loss, mourning, and reflection on the cost of their country's alliances with Nazi Germany. In the broader historical debate, Ostrogozhsk Rossosh is sometimes referred to as the forgotten Stalingrad. Its scale of destruction, measured in tens of thousands of casualties, rivaled more famous battles, yet it remained less well known, partly because it coincided with the climactic events at Stalingrad. For military historians, however, the operation holds significance as an example of Soviet operational art, the vulnerabilities of coalition warfare, and the catastrophic consequences of inadequate preparation for mechanized winter combat. The legacy of the battle thus lies in multiple dimensions. It was a turning point for Soviet military confidence, a disaster for Axis allies, a political rupture for Hungary and Italy, and a lesson in the fragility of overextended coalitions. On the snowy fields of the Don, entire armies vanished, leaving behind only prisoners, graves, and memories. The defeat marked the end of Hungary and Italy as effective participants in the Eastern Front and symbolized the unraveling of the Axis in Eastern Europe. In this sense, the Ostrogozhsk Rossosh battle stands as a hidden but decisive chapter in the wider story of the Second World War.